Here in this lecture video, we're going to look at the Advaita Vedanta school of Hindu philosophy, an orthodox school. Specifically, we're going to look at Adi Shankaracharya, or otherwise known as Sankara, and his text, The Crest Jewel of Discrimination, about the argument for why the self is really just Brahman. So let's look at an overview of the Advaita Vedanta school. So their epistemology is similar to Nyaya in that they accept perception, inference, comparison, and testimony as valid sources of knowledge. But the difference is they also accept presumption. And their argument is that all of those 5 different sources of knowledge, the ways in which we come to know things about the world, about all that exists, they're all actually in service of testimony of the Vedas. So they all ultimately serve to reinforce the testimony of the Vedas. Their theory about being is that all is one. So they are a monist school. All is one, all is really Brahman. This is where the Advaita Vedanta school really distinguishes itself from the previous schools like Nyaya, Samkhya, and Yoga. So the Advaita school posits that the relationship between Brahman, meaning God, or the impersonal absolute, that which makes possible everything, and the Atman, which is the individual self, is Advaita, which means non-dual, that there is no difference, right? It's not the case that there is the material self and then maybe an immaterial, God, but that they are all of the fundamentally same substance, one thing, whatever that is that you want to call it. Their soteriology, so their theory of liberation, how one is liberated from from samsara, the cycle of reincarnation, is that moksha, liberation, is achieved through realization that Atman, the self, has a non-dual relationship with Brahman. So that is the goal of Advaita Vedanta, is to argue that there is no difference between God and the self, that all is one, all is God. And so even when they argue that liberation is achieved through the realization that Atman has a non-dual relationship with Brahman, it sounds like there's maybe a kind of change in consciousness or whatever else, but really that change is nominal. It doesn't ultimately occur since there is ultimately no ontological change at all. So the Atman. The argument is that, first, there must be something which makes possible all things. So if we want to know how did I come, to exist, well, we could say, okay, I had parents, right? What made parents possible? They had parents. And then so on ad infinitum, right? Parents need other parents, and so on, How do human beings come to exist? Well, maybe there need to be bacteria or consciousness or whatever else, right? But then you can ask, well, what made possible those different things? And so on, again, ad infinitum, right? So to explain why anything exists at all, you end up falling back on an infinite causal chain of reasons. That seems absurd. It's illogical, because then you can't actually have any reason for why anything exists at all. You need to posit then, so Advaita Vedanta argues, that there must be one supreme thing which makes possible all other things. That one thing is the one supreme being, God, the Atman, all the same thing. So Shankara says that the Atman is indivisible, eternal, one without a second, that it is eternally made manifest by power of its own knowledge. So all other things that come to exist because of other things. There's only one thing which is the source of its own existence, and that is God. And that's no different than saying existence is the source of its own existence, or the universe is the source of itself. It always existed. And necessarily, it had to always exist, because things exist now, and it only makes sense to posit that there is one thing that has always existed out of necessity by itself, which makes possible everything else. Now, whatever that thing must be then, it must be what we call God, or Brahman. Now, the Atman, then, which is the real self, not the physical material self, which we typically take to be, who we really are, that the Atman is a self-existent reality. the real self. Now, some people might think of this as your soul, but it's not so much as your soul in that sometimes when we think about a soul, we can think of it as being immaterial and somehow different from other things and then separate from other souls. The idea that that Sankara is trying to expound here is that your soul or your true self, the Atman, is all actually one, that you are the same as everyone else is the same as God. And it is God then, being one and the same as the Atman in yourself, which is the basis of our consciousness ego, of the possibility of us even going wrong and supposing that I am a separate being from other beings at all. It's what makes possible appearances. So Sankara says its nature of the Atman is eternal consciousness. It knows all things, from the sense of ego to the body itself. It is the knower of pleasure and pain and of the sense objects. It knows everything objectively, just as a man knows the objective existence of a jar. So everything, as you should be seeing now, comes back to the self, or specifically the Atman, and Atman having a non-dual relationship with Brahman. So where does suffering occur? Where is it that we go wrong in life? Well, the argument is that where we go wrong in life is that we end up mistaking what is not Atman for our real self. Specifically, we end up thinking that our physical body or our feelings, our memories, all those other things are our true self. These involve what Sankara calls 5 bodily coverings. The physical body, the Annamaya Kosha, the mental covering, Manomaya Kosha, the covering of subtle energy, Pranamaya Kosha, the covering of intellect, Vijnanamaya Kosha, and the covering of bliss, Anandamaya Kosha. These 5 bodily coverings are what we appear to be our real self. It's what we experience. But our experience can go wrong because we become attached to those appearances. So these 5 bodily coverings are not the true self. They are not our Atman. I want to look at 3 of these, the physical covering, the intellectual covering, and the mental covering, because I think these are the most intuitive of our experience and what we typically take to be our true individual self, right? Who we really are. And we're going to see 3 different arguments as to why these 3 different coverings are not our true self. So first, let's look at the physical covering, perhaps the one that people are according to Advaita Vedanta, right, most ignorant about, the ones that perhaps people take most commonly as being their true self. So we already know about our body, our physical body, that it did not exist before we were born. We know that it won't exist after we die, right? Because our skin, our flesh, and so on comes into being. When we die, it degrades away back into the universe. That our body is a compound, so we can, I can cut off my arm and I would still be here. I would still be me. So that means then the body, if I can still, cut off parts of my body, and if I am reincarnated, and my body did not exist before I was born and will not exist after I die, then it can't be who I really am. As Sankara says, the body consists of arms, legs, and other limbs. It is not the Atman. For when some of these limbs have been cut off, a man may continue to live and function through his remaining organs. The body is controlled by another. The body is controlled by actually the mind, the intellect, something which seems immaterial if the body then we want to say is material. That means the body cannot be the Atman, the controller of itself. And again, right, the goal is to show how the true self is one and the same as Brahman, and Brahman is the only thing which is the source of its own existence. It is the only thing which is not controlled by another. But we can look at this in a specific logical form here. So the first premise then that Sankara puts forward is the Atman pervades and controls everything, being eternal and outside birth and death. Premise 2. Each physical body, though, is limited to a particular time and place. So each physical body then is not eternal. It is not outside birth and death. Also, each physical body then is mortal and impermanent. And this must mean the conclusion, therefore, it is impossible for the body to be the Atman. So if the body is not the Atman, the body is not the Atman, the physical covering is not the Atman, perhaps the mental covering, we might say, is just the mind in general might be our true self. Now, the mind is the cause of the sense of I, of the ego, of mind, to where I can say, this is my coffee mug. And when I brew this coffee, this is my coffee. Somehow it's mine and not yours. Now, supposing that there's a thing that is an I, and that I can then attach other things to then this I, right, link them together, this is due to ignorance, according to Sankara. Ignorance is generated then in the mind, since already the sense of I is wrong because, well, who I am is not distinct from, for example, Brahman. So the mind then ends up being the source of our ignorance about the true cause of suffering. But what this also means is that the mind is both the cause of humanity's bondage and also of its liberation. If it is the source of its ignorance, it's also the source of its wisdom. Sankara says the mind creates attachment to the body and the things of this world. Thus it binds a man as a beast tied by a rope. But it is also the mind which creates in a man an utter distaste for sense objects, as if for poison. Thus it freed him from his bondage. Now the logical argument put forward by Sankara begins with the premise, 1, that the Atman has no beginning or end, nor is it the object of experience. Objects of experience are particular things, again, like a mug, which has a beginning and an end. Premise 2, the mental covering has a beginning and an end, right? When I feel happiness or sorrow, I notice when I'm feeling that and when I'm not feeling that. When I perceive something and I say, oh, that's my friend, there's a definitive a person that I can say is mine and is related to certain feelings in the mind. The mental covering then is subject to change because these feelings come and go. The mental covering itself, though, is also an object of experience. I can talk about it. I can study it in similar ways that I can study a mug or a friend or a book. The Atman, though, according to premise 1, has none of those things. That must mean, therefore, that the mental covering cannot be the Atman. The mind itself, as just a source of our experience, of our consciousness, cannot be the Atman, cannot be who we truly are. Then perhaps the covering of intellect, or we can think of this as reason itself. Maybe reason itself is who we really are. In a sense, this is what someone like René Descartes, the early modern Western philosopher, argues. Sankara thinks no, and he puts forward this argument here, that reason itself, even if we use our mind, or even if our mind uses reason, then it's not reason in the mind that is our true self either. So the first premise is that the intellect possesses the faculty of knowing and acting and is the will. Because remember, Brahman is the source of its own existence. It is the source of its own will. And we want to say, well, reason itself is the source of what it determines to be perhaps true or good or correct and so on, right? So the intellect then, the use of reason, possesses the faculty of knowing and therefore seems to be the source of its own will. The intellect, though, in being the source of its own will, ends up making mistakes. The will is often actually influenced by tendencies and impressions that are brought about by the mind, which is brought about by the mind's interest in the material physical world. These tendencies and impressions are formed in previous births, so they're a result of karma, previous things we have done in previous existence. The Atman, though, never makes mistakes. It's impossible for it to make mistakes because the Atman is just simply the source of everything. It is impossible for the source of everything to make mistakes. Now, maybe you could say, yes, but mistakes exist, and if they exist, they must be a result of that which makes possible mistakes. But that's not quite right, because mistakes are actually due to a certain interpretation of what makes possible mistakes, certain interpretations of the Atman, of our sense of the true self. So the Atman itself then is not the source of mistakes, because the Atman does not make mistakes. Perhaps then supposed manifestations of the Atman do. Again, when we take ourselves to be someone separate from God, or we take ourselves to really be this physical being, right? I go wrong, I err. And that would therefore mean the intellect is not the Atman either. What then is the Atman? Well, Brahman, in being the source of everything, and we're saying Brahman is the same as Atman, everything then is Atman. So if we reject then the 5 coverings, though, we might want to ask, isn't it the case? Doesn't it seem a bit ridiculous if, well, I'm not really my physical self, I'm not the mind, I'm not the intellect or reason. What is there that is left of me? What is there that is left of the world? It would seem that this is a kind of nihilism. How could anything exist at all? Wouldn't this therefore, according to the argument that Sankara is putting forward, mean that nothing at all exists? Sankara says no. The reason is that Brahman is the reality, the one existence, which is absolutely independent of human thought or idea. The fact that Brahman is the reality, the only reality, means that when we think that all that there is the physical self or the mental self or the faculty of the intellect, the intellectual covering, or just even maybe the 5 coverings taken together, right? That's what really exists. Again, that is breaking up the universe into little bits and pieces that can be defined, and it's confusing what actually makes possible everything else in existence, right? So the universe then seems to be composed of diverse forms when we can break it up into perhaps the 5 coverings of ourself. But it is really all just Brahman alone. To explain this, Sankara uses a kind of analogy here. So he says a jar made of clay is not other than clay. Now we can say that we have many different kinds of jars, right? And that, if I have, I don't have 2 different mugs here, but if I had 2 different kinds of mugs, perhaps they're made out of clay, I could say, see, these are 2 distinct kinds of things. But Sankara says they're both clay essentially. That when you get down to it, what makes them possible is their clayness. The form of the jar has no independent existence then from the fact that it must be clay. So what then is the jar? It's merely an invented name. This mug, being separate from other manifestations of clay, are merely conventions. They're inventions for some other reason, maybe just because they work. But, he points out, the form of the jar can never be perceived apart from the clay. So what then is the jar? It's merely an appearance. And the reality, like when we take ourselves to be separate from someone else, the reality is like the clay itself. In the same way that we can take clay and mold clay into many different kinds of things, in the same way we can take reality and mold it into many different kinds of things, but they are all really just one thing. They are all Brahman, and your true self is identical with Brahman. It is non-dual. There is no difference. There is no material world and immaterial world. So Advaita Vedanta is opposed to a kind of dualism that both of these substances exist together. It is a kind of monism that says all there is one, Brahman. Yourself is Atman, which is identical with Brahman. So Sankara says, the fool thinks I am the body. The intelligent man thinks I am an individual soul united with the body. But the wise man, in the greatness of his knowledge and spiritual discrimination, sees the Atman as reality and thinks, I am Brahman. And it's saying I am Brahman is basically taking away the I altogether and just saying there is Brahman.